The scorched desert air shimmered like liquid glass as Luke Carter squinted at the weathered parchment in his trembling hands. Sweat trickled down his sun-leathered face, dripping onto the cryptic markings that promised salvation or damnation. 40 years of prospecting had left him with nothing but an aching back and empty pockets. But this map, traded from a dying Apache warrior for a canteen of water and a promise, might change everything. The legendary lost Apache mine had haunted his dreams for decades, its whispered riches drawing him deeper into the unforgiving Sonoran wasteland. Tucson's dusty streets offered little respite from the merciless sun, but Luke knew he couldn't linger here much longer. The territorial governor had just signed a decree giving the Lopez family rights to vast swaths of ancestral Apache lands, including, if Luke's calculations were correct, the mine's suspected location. Time was running out before the entire region would be crawling with surveyors and armed guards. He needed to move fast, but he couldn't do it alone. In the dim confines of the Desert Rose Saloon, Luke nursed a warm whiskey while studying his potential companions. Eleanor Hall, a raven-haired saloon girl with quick wit and quicker hands, had already expressed interest in his venture. Unlike the other working girls, she saved every penny, dreaming of opening her own dressmaker's shop. Her knowledge of local Apache customs, learned from years of trading with passing tribes, could prove invaluable. Joshua Allen sat alone in the corner, his priest's collar wilted in the heat. Luke had heard whispers about the man. How he'd been the sole survivor of a massacre at his mission near Durango. How he'd walked away from his calling after burying 47 converts. The hollow look in his eyes spoke of a man with nothing left to lose. Exactly the kind of desperate soul Luke needed for this journey. The final piece of Luke's unlikely crew arrived in the form of Nathan Nelson, an escaped slave who'd made his way west from Wichita. Nathan's tracking skills were legendary among the local hunters, and his ability to read the stars had saved more than one lost soul in the desert. He kept to himself, trading his expertise for supplies while avoiding the bounty hunters who still searched for him, even this far from Kansas territory. As Luke laid out his proposition in Eleanor's small room above the saloon, the tension was palpable. The map showed a route through the heart of Apache territory, following ancient waterways and hidden canyons. 3 days' journey, he explained, spreading the parchment across her wooden table. The mine's entrance lies beneath a formation they call the Sleeping Warrior. Inside, if the stories are true, there's enough gold to make us all rich beyond imagination. Eleanor traced the route with a delicate finger, her green eyes narrowing. The Lopez family won't take kindly to claim jumpers, she warned, especially with their new territorial rights. And the Apache, they consider that whole region sacred ground. They'll kill anyone who violates it, especially after the governor's betrayal. Luke noticed how she avoided mentioning the other dangers, the scorpions, the lack of water, the madness that took men in the deep desert. Joshua spoke for the first time, his voice rough from disuse. The Apache have their own justice. I've seen it. But perhaps. He paused, studying the map intently. Perhaps there's something worth finding out there beyond gold. Something that might restore what's been lost. His fingers absently touched the cross he still wore, though Luke suspected it had become more habit than faith. Nathan remained silent throughout the discussion, but his eyes never left the map. Finally, he spoke. 3 days out, 3 days back. Assuming we find it. Assuming we survive. That's a lot of assumptions, old man. But Luke saw the glimmer of interest in his eyes, not for the gold, but for the freedom such wealth could buy. The power to ensure no one would ever own him again. As the night deepened and plans were made, Luke felt the familiar flutter of anticipation in his chest. They would leave at dawn, traveling light and fast. Each member of this strange company had their own reasons for risking everything on an old man's dream. But Luke knew that out in the desert, motivations had a way of shifting like the sands. The map seemed to pulse with possibility in his pocket, its secrets waiting to be uncovered, its promises waiting to be fulfilled or broken. The pre-dawn hours found them gathering at the edge of town, their horses loaded with only the essentials. Eleanor had traded her saloon finery for practical riding clothes, her dark hair tied back severely. Joshua carried nothing but his Bible and a small bag of medical supplies, while Nathan had brought an intricate star chart of his own making. As the first rays of sun painted the desert in shades of blood and gold, Luke led them out of Tucson, toward the distant mountains that held either their salvation or their doom. The small party rode in silence as the morning heat began to build, their shadows stretching long across the rust-colored earth. Luke studied the terrain ahead, his weathered hands occasionally brushing the folded map in his vest pocket as if to reassure himself it was still there. The Apache territories lay ahead, their boundaries marked not by fences or posts, but by the stories of those who had ventured too far and never returned. Eleanor's mare kicked up dust as she urged her mount forward to ride alongside Luke. "You've been studying those mountains since sunrise," she said, her voice carrying a hint of her former saloon swagger despite her transformed appearance. "What aren't you telling us about what's ahead?" Her question hung in the dry air, drawing Joshua and Nathan's attention from their own contemplations. Luke considered his response carefully, aware that the success of their venture depended as much on trust as it did on the map's accuracy. "The pass we need to take," he began, pointing to a distant cleft between two peaks. "It's called Dead Man's Gate by the locals. The Apache consider it sacred ground. They say their ancestors' spirits guard it against those who come seeking riches." He didn't mention the bleached bones he'd seen scattered there years ago, a grim warning to fortune hunters. Nathan adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, consulting his star chart with scholarly precision. "According to my calculations, we'll need to time our passage through the gate with the new moon, 3 days from now. The darkness will provide cover, but it'll make navigation treacherous." His fingers traced invisible lines across the paper, connecting earthly paths with celestial guidance. Joshua rode slightly apart from the others, his collar wilting in the heat. The Bible in his saddlebag felt heavier than usual, weighted with doubts that had plagued him since witnessing the massacre at his previous parish. He watched a buzzard circle overhead and wondered if God's eyes were as dispassionate as those of the patient scavenger. As the sun climbed higher, the desert revealed its brutal nature. Heat waves distorted the horizon, creating phantom lakes that mocked their dwindling water supplies. Luke led them to a shallow cave where they could rest during the worst of the afternoon heat. The walls still held ancient pictographs, their red ochre warnings or blessings impossible to decipher. Eleanor used the brake to tend to her horse, her movements betraying years of experience that seemed at odds with her former profession. "I had a life before the saloon," she said quietly, catching Luke's questioning glance. "My father raised horses in Durango before the fever took him. This mare's grandfather was one of his prize stallions." Her words carried the weight of memories she usually kept locked away. Nathan spread his charts on a flat rock, making careful annotations while Joshua paced the cave's entrance, torn between his duty to protect his companions and his growing certainty that they were trespassing on land that demanded more respect than a treasure hunt could offer. The priest's hands occasionally strayed to the cross at his neck, but found no comfort in its familiar shape. As evening approached, Luke gathered them to share his plan for the next phase of their journey. They would need to cross a stretch of open desert before reaching Dead Man's Gate, leaving them exposed to both the elements and any watching eyes. The Apache weren't the only threat. Renegade warriors who had broken from their tribes were known to prey on travelers in these parts, showing no mercy to trespassers. The dying sun painted the desert in shades of purple and crimson, colors that reminded Joshua too much of that terrible day at his church. He shared his waterskin with Eleanor, who had noticed his troubled expression. "Faith's a funny thing in the desert," she said, her voice gentle. "Sometimes you have to lose it completely before you can find it again in unexpected places." The priest didn't respond, but his shoulders seemed to relax slightly at her words. Luke watched his unlikely companions as they prepared for the night ahead. Each carried their own secrets and scars, yet something about this journey had bound them together in ways he hadn't anticipated. The map in his pocket seemed to whisper promises of more than just gold. Perhaps redemption, too, lay waiting in those hostile mountains. The scorching desert sun bore down mercilessly as Luke Carter adjusted the worn leather map case strapped across his chest. His weathered fingers traced the crude markings that promised untold riches in the Apache territories ahead. Behind him, Eleanor Lopez kept her distance, the former saloon girl's elegant dress looking increasingly out of place as they ventured further from civilization. Father Nathan Hall walked in contemplative silence, his collar wilted in the heat, while Isaac Allen, the escaped slave who'd joined their unlikely band, scouted ahead with practiced caution. The small trading post outside Tucson had been their last glimpse of civilization 3 days prior. Luke knew the dangers that lay ahead, not just from the tribal warriors who guarded their ancestral lands with fierce determination, but from the savage landscape itself. The ancient map, passed to him by a dying prospector in a Durango saloon, showed a route through treacherous canyon country that few white men had ever survived. Eleanor's refined accent cut through the oppressive silence. "Mr. Carter, I believe we're being followed." Her dark eyes scanned the rocky ridgeline to their west, where heat waves distorted the horizon. Luke had noticed it too. Fleeting shadows moving parallel to their course, keeping to the high ground. The Apache were already aware of their presence, though they had yet to show themselves. Father Nathan clutched his wooden cross, more from habit than faith these days. The massacre at the mission in Pueblo had stripped away his certainties about God's plan. Now he sought redemption in this journey, though he couldn't say exactly what form it might take. The priest's skills as a healer had already proved valuable, treating Eleanor's blistered feet and Luke's scorpion sting during their first nights on the trail. Isaac returned from his scouting run, moving with the fluid grace that had helped him escape the slave hunters in Wichita months before. "There's a box canyon ahead," he reported quietly. "Signs of recent camp activity? Maybe 20, 25 people?" Luke nodded grimly. The map showed the canyon as a crucial passage. There would be no way around it without adding days to their journey and depleting their precious water supplies. The group made camp that evening in a natural hollow, sheltered by towering red rock formations. As they huddled around a small fire, Eleanor revealed that she'd grown up on tales of the legendary Apache mine from her Mexican grandmother. The story went that the tribe had discovered a massive gold deposit, but sealed it away rather than let it fall into Spanish hands. Luke listened intently. Every scrap of lore might prove valuable in the days ahead. Father Nathan tended to Luke's horse, which had gone lame that afternoon. The priest's gentle manner with animals was at odds with the hard glint that had taken residence in his eyes since the mission attack. "The Apache aren't our true enemy," he mused. "Greed is what drives men to violence. I've seen it consume entire communities." Luke wondered if the priest included himself in that assessment. Isaac took first watch, his keen ears attuned to the desert night. He'd joined their expedition not for gold, but for the promise of enough money to buy his family's freedom. The irony of seeking Apache gold to purchase black freedom wasn't lost on him. But desperation had a way of simplifying moral calculations, as all of them had learned. The next morning brought new challenges. Their water supplies were running lower than expected, and Luke spotted vultures circling ahead. Never a good sign in this unforgiving country. Eleanor had proved surprisingly resilient, keeping pace without complaint despite her city upbringing. She'd confided in Isaac that she planned to open her own establishment once she had enough capital. Not just another saloon, but a proper hotel that would cater to respectable clientele. They discovered the source of the vulture's interest by midday. A dead horse and rider, picked clean by scavengers. The man's saddlebags had been thoroughly looted, but Luke found a journal wedged in a saddlebag's torn lining. The final entries described a party of miners who'd ventured into Apache territory 2 months prior, searching for the same legendary mine. None had been seen since. Father Nathan offered a brief prayer over the unnamed rider's remains, while the others searched the area for any useful supplies. Eleanor found a brass spyglass that proved to be in working order, a small piece of luck in an otherwise grim scene. Isaac's expression remained neutral, but Luke noticed how he examined the dead man's boots, perhaps seeing another fate that might have awaited him had his escape gone differently. The afternoon brought the first direct contact with their shadowy observers. 3 mounted Apache warriors appeared on a ridge less than half a mile ahead, making no aggressive moves but clearly sending a message. Luke knew enough of their ways to recognize this as a warning rather than a threat, for now. The group's next decisions would determine whether they faced hostility or merely cautious observation. Eleanor surprised them all by addressing the distant warriors in halting Apache phrases she'd learned from her grandmother. Though they made no obvious response, Luke sensed a subtle shift in the tension. The woman's knowledge of their language, however basic, demonstrated a respect few white travelers bothered to show. It might prove the difference between passage and conflict in the days ahead. As they made camp that night, Father Nathan shared dried beef and hard biscuits while Luke studied the map by firelight. The priest spoke of his crisis of faith, of watching helplessly as raiders slaughtered his missionary students. "I couldn't understand why God would allow such evil," he admitted. Now I wonder if we're the evil ones, constantly pushing into lands that aren't ours, taking what isn't offered. Isaac took the spyglass for his watch, though the quarter moon cast little light. He'd developed an uncanny ability to spot movement in darkness during his months evading slave hunters. Eleanor sat beside him for a time, and Luke overheard fragments of their quiet conversation, shared stories of lives constrained by others' rules and expectations. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, they'd found common ground in their quest for independence. The dawn brought an unsettling discovery. Luke found fresh horse tracks crossing their trail, heading toward the same mountain pass they needed to traverse. The hoofprints showed at least 6 riders, moving fast and light. He recognized the distinctive pattern of Apache war ponies, unshod and sure-footed. Eleanor noticed his troubled expression as he traced the tracks with weathered fingers, and she knelt beside him, her skirts gathering desert dust. "Those could be hunting parties," Isaac suggested quietly, but his tense posture betrayed deeper concerns. During his flight north, he'd learned to read danger in the smallest signs. The morning wind carried a faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere ahead, suggesting their path would soon intersect with others who knew these lands far better than they did. Father Nathan spent longer than usual with his morning prayers, muttering in Latin while fingering his rosary. The crisis of faith that had driven him from his mission still weighed heavily, but Luke noticed the priest watching the horizon with increasing alertness. Perhaps old instincts from his frontier ministry were awakening. They broke camp quickly, leaving minimal trace of their presence. The terrain grew more challenging as they approached the pass. Steep canyon walls of red rock towered above them, creating natural choke points that made Luke increasingly uneasy. Eleanor's horse stumbled on loose scree, sending small avalanches of stone clattering down the slope. Each echo seemed to announce their presence to unseen watchers. Isaac took point, his experience in moving undetected proving invaluable. He led them through shallow creek beds where the water would mask their tracks, and found paths between rock formations that offered some cover. The spyglass passed frequently between them as they scanned the ridgelines for movement. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly on the exposed rock. By midday, they reached a crucial decision point. The main trail led through a narrow defile, the most direct route according to Luke's map, but also the most obvious place for an ambush. An alternative path wound several miles to the east, longer but potentially safer. Eleanor surprised them all by suggesting a third option, approaching the nearest Apache camp openly to negotiate passage. "These people have protocols, traditions," she explained, drawing on knowledge gained from her years working in frontier saloons. "They respect strength, but they respect honesty more. Sneaking through their territory like thieves will only convince them we have ill intent." Father Nathan nodded slowly, seeing wisdom in her words despite his painful history with tribal violence. Luke studied the map again, noting marks that might indicate Apache settlements. The legendary mine they sought lay in mountains that had been Apache territory for generations. Perhaps Eleanor was right. Any hope of reaching it would require some form of understanding with the indigenous people who called these lands home. The question was whether they could establish trust before arrows started flying. As they debated their options, Isaac spotted dust on the horizon, riders approaching from the direction they'd come. "Someone's following our trail," he announced grimly, moving fast. The group's dynamic shifted instantly from discussion to action. They needed to make a choice quickly, and that choice would determine not just their path to the mine, but their chances of survival. The sound of distant hoofbeats grew clearer, carried on the hot desert wind. Luke made his decision, knowing it would test the fragile bonds holding their unlikely company together. They would attempt Eleanor's approach, an honest parley with the Apache. But first, they needed to evade their immediate pursuers. He suspected he knew who was following them, and that knowledge made his jaw clench with old anger. They moved swiftly into a box canyon where Father Nathan had spotted signs of a seasonal spring. The priest's knowledge of local water sources, gained during his missionary years, proved invaluable. As they prepared their position, Luke shared his suspicion that Joshua, a rival prospector from Tucson with a reputation for claim jumping, had somehow learned of the map and was now on their trail. Eleanor helped Isaac arrange their supplies to look like abandoned cargo, creating a false camp while the rest of them found hiding places in the high rocks. The trap was set. Now they would discover whether their pursuers were Apache scouts Joshua's gang, or something else entirely. The canyon walls amplified every sound, including Luke's own heartbeat, as they waited in tense silence for the riders to appear. The merciless desert sun beat down as Luke Carter squinted at the crude map in his weathered hands, the parchment's edges crumbling like the red rock surrounding them. Behind him, Father Nathan Lopez muttered a string of curses that would have scandalized his former congregation, while Caroline Hall adjusted her fancy dress, now torn and dust-covered from their arduous journey. Isaac Allen, the escaped slave who'd joined their unlikely band, kept watch from a high ridge, his keen eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The Apache territory stretched before them like a vast sea of stone and sand, dotted with twisted juniper trees and thorny brush. They'd left Durango 3 days ago, following the map's cryptic markings toward what Luke swore was the legendary mine. But the cost of their journey had already proven steep. They'd lost 2 horses to rattlesnake bites, and their water supplies were running dangerously low. "We should have stayed in Durango," Caroline said, her voice hoarse from thirst. Once a working girl at the town's most notorious saloon, she'd thrown in her lot with them on the promise of enough gold to buy her own establishment. Now, watching Father Nathan dig another prickly pear spine from his palm, she wondered if any amount of gold was worth dying in this godforsaken wasteland. Isaac's sharp whistle cut through the afternoon heat. "Riders coming!" he called down, his voice urgent but controlled. "At least 8 of them, moving fast from the east." Luke quickly folded the map and tucked it into his shirt as the others scrambled for cover behind the nearest rocks. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by war cries that made Caroline's blood run cold. The Apache warriors swept into the narrow canyon like a dust devil, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of red earth. But instead of attacking, they circled the group's position, their leader holding up a hand in what appeared to be a gesture of parley. Luke recognized him as Joshua, a half-Apache scout he'd once traded with in Tucson. The man's presence here couldn't be coincidence. "You seek the sacred place," Joshua called out in accented English, his face impassive beneath the blazing sun. "The place of yellow metal that drives white men mad." He dismounted gracefully, approaching their position with open hands. Father Nathan gripped his crucifix, while Isaac's finger tensed on his rifle's trigger. Luke stepped forward, knowing the next few moments would determine whether they lived or died. Joshua revealed that the mine they sought was indeed real, but it lay within the most sacred grounds of his people. The map Luke possessed had been stolen from a medicine man's body decades ago, and its existence had brought nothing but bloodshed. The warrior's words struck Father Nathan particularly hard, reminding him of the massacre he'd witnessed that had shaken his faith to its core. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon walls, Joshua offered them a choice that none had expected. The Apache would guide them to the mine, but they must swear to use only what gold they could carry on their backs, and to ensure the map never led another party to this place. The alternative was a fight none of them would survive. Luke looked at his companions, Caroline with her dreams of independence, Isaac seeking the means to build a new life in freedom, and Father Nathan, whose lost faith might find redemption in choosing right over riches. The decision weighed heavily, but in that moment, he saw something in their eyes that transcended mere greed. They had become something more than treasure hunters. They had become family. With the decision made, Joshua led them through twisting canyons as stars began to pepper the darkening sky. The Apache warriors flanked them silently, their presence both reassuring and unnerving. Caroline rode close to Isaac, who had become her unlikely protector throughout their journey. Father Nathan's prayers had returned, though they now carried a different tone, one of gratitude rather than desperation. The mine's entrance appeared suddenly, a dark maw in the red rock face that seemed to exhale the breath of centuries. Joshua explained that his people had long known of this place, but considered it cursed, not for its gold, but for the greed it inspired in men's hearts. As they prepared to enter, Luke realized that their true test wasn't finding the mine. It was maintaining their humanity once inside. Inside, the torch-lit passages revealed veins of gold so pure they seemed to glow with their own light. But as they worked to extract their agreed-upon share, something unexpected happened. The cave walls began to shake, and the sound of rushing water echoed through the tunnels. An underground spring, disturbed by their activities, threatened to flood the entire system. In the chaos that followed, their true characters emerged. Luke led the evacuation, ensuring everyone made it out safely before himself. Caroline surprised them all by returning to help Father Nathan when he stumbled. Isaac's strength and quick thinking saved several Apache warriors from being crushed by falling rocks. The mine, it seemed, had tested them in ways far beyond their expectations. As they emerged into the starlit night, soaked and covered in mud but alive, they discovered that the cave entrance had collapsed completely. The legendary Apache mine was now sealed forever, taking its secrets back into the earth. Joshua's people seemed unsurprised, as if the land itself had made its judgment on their presence there. Their return journey to Durango was markedly different from their approach. Though they carried less gold than they'd hoped, they had gained something far more valuable. Caroline and Isaac spoke of opening a legitimate business together, while Father Nathan had found a new purpose ministering to both settlers and natives. Luke realized that the true treasure had been the transformation of their unlikely band of misfits into a family bound by something stronger than blood. As they approached Durango, the group encountered an unexpected obstacle, a contingent of territorial marshals led by the ruthless Caleb Hawkins. He had caught wind of their expedition and claimed they had violated federal laws by trespassing on protected Apache lands. The aging Luke recognized the real motivation behind the accusation. Caleb wanted the gold for himself, having pursued rumors of the mine for years. The marshals surrounded their camp at dusk, the orange sun casting long shadows across the desert scrub. Caroline stepped forward, her newfound confidence evident as she produced documentation showing their legal right to trade with the Apache Nation. Isaac stood beside her, no longer an escaped slave but a free man ready to defend his chosen family. Father Nathan watched the confrontation with renewed purpose, his hand resting on the worn Bible that now meant something different to him. Luke observed how his companions had changed. The desperate prospector who had first assembled this unlikely crew was gone, replaced by a man who valued the bonds they'd forged more than any gold. He saw how Caroline's shrewd business sense had evolved beyond her former life, how Isaac's quest for freedom had transformed into a journey of self-discovery, and how Nathan had found authentic faith in human connections rather than rigid doctrine. The night grew tense as Caleb refused to accept their explanations. Joshua and his Apache warriors materialized from the darkness, silent guardians who had followed them to ensure safe passage. Their presence changed the dynamics immediately. The territorial marshals, realizing they were now outnumbered by both legal documents and armed allies, began to withdraw, though Caleb's bitter threats echoed across the desert. Dawn brought them within sight of Durango's modest skyline. Caroline and Isaac discussed locations for their trading post, a venture that would bridge cultures rather than exploit them. Father Nathan had already received word that a small congregation of both settlers and natives awaited his guidance. The mine's gold might have been lost, but the real wealth lay in the future they could now build together. Luke felt the weight of his years as they entered the town, but it was a different burden now, the responsibility of nurturing what they had created. The townspeople stared at their unusual group. The aging prospector, the former prostitute turned businesswoman, the freed slave who walked with his head held high, the renewed priest, and their Apache allies. They represented something new in the territory, a glimpse of what could be possible when people looked past their differences. In the following weeks, their ventures took root in Durango. Caroline and Isaac's trading post became a meeting place for all communities, while Father Nathan's congregation grew as he preached a message of unity learned in the depths of the earth. Joshua's people found reliable trading partners who respected their traditions, and Luke discovered that mentoring the younger generation brought more satisfaction than any mining claim. The legendary Apache mine remained sealed, its entrance collapsed and location lost to time. But its true purpose had been fulfilled, not as a source of material wealth, but as the catalyst that brought together souls who would never have connected otherwise. The desert frontier, harsh and unforgiving as it was, had forced them to see beyond their prejudices and find strength in their differences. One evening, as they gathered for a meal at the trading post, Luke looked around the table at his unlikely family. Caroline's business ledgers sat beside Isaac's carefully drawn maps of safe passages. Father Nathan blessed the food with words that honored both Christian and Apache traditions. The sounds of Durango's growing community drifted through the windows, a symphony of multiple languages and cultures learning to coexist. The aging prospector realized that they had discovered something far more precious than gold. They had found a way to bridge the divide between worlds, to prove that the frontier's future lay not in conflict, but in cooperation. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant hues of red and gold, Luke understood that their real journey was just beginning. The scorched desert floor stretched endlessly before them as Luke Carter studied the tattered map one final time. His weathered fingers traced the route they'd followed these past weeks, each crease and stain a reminder of their harrowing journey. Behind him, Nathan Hall tended to Eleanor's wounds, the former slave's gentle hands cleaning the gash on the prostitute's arm where an Apache arrow had grazed her. Father Isaac Lopez sat apart from the group, his once pristine collar now grimy with trail dust, muttering what might have been prayers or possibly curses. The legendary mine lay just beyond the next ridge, according to Luke's calculations. But the morning's skirmish with the Apache war party had left them with precious little ammunition and even less water. Eleanor had proven herself far tougher than any of them expected, matching Luke's grim determination with a fierce resolve of her own. Her dreams of opening a proper boarding house in Durango drove her forward, even as the harsh terrain left her feet bleeding through worn boots. Nathan's eyes constantly scanned the horizon, his years of bondage having taught him to read danger in the subtlest signs. A distant dust cloud, the unnatural silence of desert birds, the way the wind carried whispers across the sand. He'd joined their expedition hoping the Apache territories might offer the freedom he sought, but now he wondered if they'd all find only death in these merciless lands. Father Isaac had stopped wearing his collar 3 days ago after they'd discovered the remains of the massacre at the mission. The sight of butchered children had shattered what remained of his faith, yet something kept him moving forward. Perhaps the need to understand why God had abandoned this place, or maybe just the human instinct to survive. His knowledge of local dialects had saved them more than once during tense encounters with native scouts. The sun hung low on the horizon when they finally crested the ridge. Below them spread a valley unlike anything they'd imagined. Not the barren crater Luke had expected, but a hidden oasis of spring-fed pools and ancient stone dwellings carved into the cliff face. The legendary Apache mine wasn't a mine at all, but something far more valuable, a sacred place of healing waters and shelter from the brutal desert. Eleanor was the first to understand the true significance. "This isn't about gold," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's life itself." The waters below held minerals with remarkable healing properties, worth far more than any gold to the right buyers. But reaching those waters meant crossing the valley floor, where Apache sentinels surely waited. The group huddled behind a boulder as darkness approached, each lost in their own thoughts about what came next. Nathan's tracking skills revealed at least 20 Apache warriors concealed among the rocks below. A frontal approach would be suicide. But Luke had noticed something else: the way the cliff dwellings were positioned, the hidden paths that seemed to wind behind the waterfalls. "There's another way in," he said quietly. "The old ones who built this place, they wouldn't have left just one entrance." Father Isaac studied the ancient markings carved into the nearby rocks, his academic training finding purpose again. "These symbols, they're not Apache. They're much older. This place belonged to others long before, people who built in harmony with the water and stone." His fingers traced the weathered pictographs, reading a story that had waited centuries to be told. As moonlight bathed the valley in silver, Eleanor shared the plan she'd been forming. Her years in saloons had taught her how to create diversions, to direct attention where she wanted it. With Nathan's knowledge of moving unseen and Isaac's understanding of the old markings, they might find a way to reach the waters without bloodshed. Luke listened, seeing this woman who'd joined them seeking fortune now leading them towards something far more profound. The next morning brought their greatest test. While Eleanor drew the Apache sentinels' attention with a boldly obvious approach from the south, Luke and Nathan followed the hidden path Isaac had discovered. The ancient steps, worn smooth by countless feet, led them behind the thundering waters and into the heart of the cliff dwellings. What they found there changed everything they'd believed about their journey. The cavern chambers held not only the healing springs, but also evidence of an ancient peace, a place where different peoples had once gathered in truce to share the water's blessing. As Luke stood in that sacred space, he felt the weight of his years fall away. This wasn't a prize to be claimed, but a trust to be honored. Nathan saw in the ancient drawings a story of cooperation that transcended the divisions of race and tribe. When the Apache war chief found them there, it was Father Isaac who bridged the gap. His broken Spanish and fragments of native tongue conveyed not ownership but reverence. Eleanor's presence, a woman seeking not to take but to understand, helped ease the tensions. The chief's own daughter had been dying from fever, and the healing waters offered hope where modern medicine had failed. In the end, they left the valley carrying something more valuable than gold. Knowledge of a place where hatred and division held no power. Eleanor used her savings to build a modest way station nearby, where travelers of all kinds could rest and heal. Nathan found his freedom not in escape, but in purpose, helping guide others to the waters. Father Isaac rediscovered his faith in the simple act of serving those in need. Luke Carter never did stake a claim to the legendary Apache mine. Instead, he became its guardian, working alongside the tribe to protect its secrets from those who would exploit them. The map that had led him there burned in the campfire that first night, its ashes carried away by a wind that whispered of ancient wisdom and the true wealth of the desert frontier. The years that followed saw the little way station grow into a sanctuary of sorts. People came from as far as Tucson and Pueblo seeking healing, finding in those waters and in each other something the modern world had forgotten. Eleanor's dream of a grand establishment evolved into something far more meaningful, a place where the boundaries between peoples dissolved in the shared recognition of human dignity. Time smoothed away the rough edges of their story, but its essence remained in the tales told around evening fires. How four unlikely souls had set out seeking fortune and found instead a truth as old as the desert itself. That the greatest treasures aren't those we take from the earth, but those we discover in the depths of our own hearts when we dare to look beyond our prejudices and fears. As autumn turned to winter, the way station's reputation spread like wildfire across the territories. What had begun as a simple refuge evolved into something approaching legend. A place where Apache elders shared wisdom with former Union soldiers, where freed slaves taught settlers the secrets of desert agriculture, and where Eleanor's business acumen transformed humble adobe walls into a thriving community. The old prospector, his dreams of gold long abandoned, found peace in tending the medicinal garden that flourished near the healing springs. His weathered hands, once calloused from gripping pick and shovel, now cultivated herbs that blended native wisdom with frontier practicality. On quiet evenings, he would sit with the Apache elders, learning their stories and sharing his own. The weight of his earlier prejudices dissolved in the waters of understanding. Eleanor proved that her ambitions had never truly been about personal wealth. She established a school where children of all backgrounds learned together, their laughter echoing across the desert plains. The former brothel owner became known as a fierce advocate for women's independence, helping many escape desperate circumstances to find dignity and purpose in the growing community. The priest, once lost in his crisis of faith, discovered a different kind of ministry. He no longer preached from a pulpit, but worked alongside others, finding divine presence in acts of compassion and the slow healing of ancient wounds. The massacre that had shattered his faith became a catalyst for building bridges between peoples who had long viewed each other with suspicion and hatred. News reached them of changes sweeping the territories. Railroads pushing westward, new settlements sprouting like desert flowers after rain. But their sanctuary remained somewhat apart, a pocket of peace in an increasingly frantic world. Traders coming through from Durango brought stories of similar communities forming, inspired by what had been achieved at the springs. As years passed, the original founders watched their work take root and flourish. Children born to former enemies played together in the dust, speaking a mixture of English, Spanish, and Apache. The healing waters continued to draw seekers, but now they found more than physical relief. They discovered a model of how the frontier might be something other than a place of conquest and conflict. When word came that government surveyors were marking boundaries for new territories, the community faced its greatest challenge. But the bonds forged in shared struggle proved stronger than any external threat. Apache leaders and settler representatives traveled together to Tucson, presenting a united petition for protection of their unique experiment in coexistence. The old prospector lived to see their success, though his hair had turned white as desert salt. On his last evening, sitting beneath stars that seemed to burn with particular brightness, he shared a final story with the gathered community. He spoke not of the gold he'd once sought, but of the true treasure he'd found, the wealth of human connection that had transformed them all. After his passing, they buried him on a hill overlooking the springs, marking his grave with a simple stone that bore no name, for he had become part of something larger than any individual identity. The winds that swept across his resting place carried the sounds of children laughing, of prayers in multiple languages, of life continuing in all its complex beauty. Eleanor maintained her position as the community's practical guardian, though she too had changed profoundly. The ambitious young woman who had arrived seeking fortune had become a respected elder, her sharp business sense now devoted to preserving their shared vision for future generations. She established a trust to protect the springs, ensuring that their healing powers would never be exploited for private gain. The story of their journey spread far beyond the desert territories, carried by travelers who had experienced the miracle of their community. From Pueblo to Wichita, people spoke of the place where ancient wisdom and frontier dreams had merged to create something entirely new. It became a symbol of hope in a time of rapid change, proof that the human heart could transcend the boundaries of race and circumstance. As the 19th century drew to a close, their sanctuary stood as testament to a different kind of pioneer spirit. One that sought not to conquer the wilderness but to learn from it, not to displace others but to grow alongside them. The map that had started their journey had long since turned to ash, but it had led them to a treasure far more precious than gold: the knowledge that in the harsh embrace of the desert, humanity could find its better self.